Hi, my name is Jane Scarf, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Canadian rights. This is a fancy copy of it, and it's signed by Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Prime Minister John G. Diefenbaker in 1960. And I'll be reading a quote from him in a little bit. I want to start first by saying what the history of this bill was. After World War II, basically all the countries in the world joined together, and they articulated the rights that they wanted to have their countries operate under. And they developed an international covenant of rights and freedoms. And each country signed on to it, but as things evolved, it didn't end up being a very effective way of establishing protections for these rights, because the courts didn't recognize the jurisdiction of this international covenant. So luckily in Canada, in 1960, Diefenbaker introduced this Canadian Bill of Rights. And the important thing about it is that it recognizes that your rights are inalienable. They didn't give you these rights and they can't take them away. They're strictly committing to uphold them, respect them, and help to enforce them. So it starts off in part 1. It says, it is hereby recognized and declared that in Canada there have existed and shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, national origin, color, religion, or sex, the following human rights and fundamental freedoms, namely, the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. So that is a very important right, especially today when people are worried about possibly having mandatory vaccines, mandatory PCR tests, mandatory quarantine, force being used to shut down your business, your church, your protest. This right protects you from any and all of that activity. The government cannot introduce regulations, policies, laws, or whatever to interfere with those rights. And you also have the right of the individual to equality before the law and the protection of the law, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and association, and freedom of the press. And that's section 1. Section 2 shows you that these are not conditional rights. These are straight up. Every law of Canada shall, unless it is expressly declared by an act of Parliament of Canada that it shall operate notwithstanding the Canadian Bill of Rights, be so construed and applied as not to abrogate, abridge, or infringe, or to authorize the abrogation, abridgment, or infringement of any of the rights or freedoms herein recognized and declared, and in particular, it upholds your legal rights, which I'm not going to read today because I'm more focused on the fundamental rights. The legal rights are the process of if you're being arrested and so on. Now, these rights are not conditional. They're good to go. The government cannot override them. Parliament, an act of Parliament can, which is, it's like, well, I would like to see that taken out. But that being the case, it's a very formal process to do it through an act of Parliament, because the public has to be aware of it. They get a chance to participate in it. It's discussed, it's debated, it's voted on several times. It takes about 5 years to go through that process. So they can't just willy-nilly throw things out like they've done with this COVID stuff. The criticisms of the Bill of Rights is that it's only for the federal government. However, the federal government regulates police, all police. So all police are under this Bill of Rights. Also, that's in the criminal code, and the criminal code also regulates municipal bylaw officers and the mayors. So they also fall under this jurisdiction. And then there's another criticism that, oh, well, that bill was tossed out when we brought in the charter, but that's not the case. It's still flying high as it ever was. And you can see proof of this in the Canadian Emergency Act that was introduced in 1985 and enacted in 1988. In the preamble, it says, and whereas the governor in council, in taking such special temporary measures, would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is in their emergency responses and plans. Would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. So this is 1988. This is like 5 years after, or 6 years after the charter came in. And they must have regard to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly with respect to those fundamental rights that are not to be limited or abridged, even in a national emergency. So that's pretty, the door's closed as far as the federal government being able to just, come out with the policies and laws and of any sort that override these rights. And the province is not covered by the Canadian Bill of Rights. However, they can't be using police with their emergency measures, or bylaw officers. They can't be using force. Now, there's a number of videos you can see that give you a little bit of an overview of the history of this bill. I'll put them in the credits. And one of them is a video that was made in 1960, and it was a discussion amongst intellectuals about what this bill is going to mean to Canada and so on. And the first man that spoke said that this bill was brought in to prevent communism from coming to Canada. And the other gentleman that talked as well about it, they disagreed with some of what that fellow said, but not that part. No one disagreed with him. So, and you can see the content of it too. It gives you the kind of rights that you need in order to prevent dictatorship and tyranny and all of that, and to leave you with your autonomy and your independence and all of that. We need these rights. And so they are the way that we're going to protect this country. But the problem with it is a lot of people have forgotten about it, and they're focused on the charter, and the charter is deficient because Trudeau Sr., when he supposedly was entrenching our Bill of Rights in the charter, made an addition to it, which actually undermines the rights entirely. Like, the whole idea of having these rights are to make sure the government doesn't get too big for its britches, like to keep it, in its role in service to the people. So what Trudeau did, he added in Section 1 the authority for the government, and that doesn't mean Parliament, the government can override your rights if they think they have a good enough reason. It says, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So that means just willy-nilly, if they decide that there's a good enough reason, they can override. And they can engage police in that as well, right? Because the police do not have the jurisdiction to interpret whether the government is unconstitutionally overriding your rights or not. So in the meantime, they have to follow what they're saying. And on top of that, this requires the court to look at it. So with all the COVID measures, which are violating our rights, extremely violating our rights, we can't stop them in the moment. We can't stop the police. We can't stop anyone with the charter, because the charter says, whoa, we have to wait and see what the court's going to say, whether the government is justified or not. But luckily, we don't have to go down that road, because we still have our Canadian Bill of Rights, which says they cannot override your rights, period, end of conversation. So this is my absolute favorite piece of legislation that exists in Canada, and it makes me very hopeful that we're going to be able to overcome the attack that we're under right now, the attack on our liberties, the attack on our economy, the attack on our children with these masks, all of that. But people have to be aware of it. So please look it up, read it, section 1 and 2. It'll tell you have these rights. The government can't override them. Use this to make sure that police don't shut your business down. Police don't shut your church down. Don't shut your protest down. Don't force you to quarantine, force you to PCR test, or force you vaccine. They cannot with this. And I want to read you now a quote that's in the document. It's at the bottom in the signature of John Diefenbaker, the Right Honorable John Diefenbaker, Prime Minister of Canada, House of Commons debates, July 1st, 1960. He said, I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind. That is forgotten. That's a forgotten part of our legal process. This is the rights that were evolved over 2 centuries in common law decisions, and they're still here, and they're still valid, and they're still extremely important. But we have to know them in order to be able to use them, and then we have to use them or we're going to lose them. And we do have enough time. We have plenty of time to use it. So you need to familiarize yourself with them and pass it on. Tell other people. It's active piece of legislation. We know that because of the Emergency Act 1988 saying that government has to respect that. It applies to all police, all bylaw, municipal bylaw, and the mayors. So we can do this. And I'm going to leave you with that. You can look on Google to find a copy of the Canadian Bill of Rights, and I will leave in the credits links for a few videos that you might want to watch to show this this wonderful piece of legislation we have that's going to keep us free from tyranny.